In this world was a house, and in this house lived a triangle. Her name was Wind. Wind lived all alone and was sometimes sad about that. The problem with Mr. Ugg was that he never seemed to be home. So Wind did what she always did and left him a message. Wind often went to visit Mr. Ugg. She'd walk past the big rock and a block pie, which didn't sound too appetizing to her, and the pine log, and a blue rod, and the beet peel store, though she'd never seen it open, until she got to Mr. Ugg's little yellow house. It was a store which sold beef and beer, though unfortunately it seemed to have closed long ago. So Wind did what she always did and left him a message, so that he'd know that she'd been there. "Hi, Mr. Ugg," she wrote. She hung around a little longer, hoping he might come home soon. When she got back, she saw that someone had left her a message. It said, "Hi, Wind." Mr. Ugg must have come by to see her while she was out trying to see him. She kicked herself for waiting around so long at his house. Maybe if she'd gotten back sooner, she could have caught him while he was still there. So she simply continued their conversation by leaving another message. "How are you right now?" she asked, and turned around to go home. Her grammar and spelling weren't so good because, after all, there was no school in her little world. For example, when she got home, she found that Mr. Ugg had already written a reply to her "How are you?" He'd said, "Nom in life, nom." She thought this was a beautiful metaphor and felt lucky to have a neighbor who never answered "How are you?" with something boring like "Fine, thank you." But what she really wanted, more than anything, was to actually meet him, see his face for the first time. She decided to try another tactic. She erased his note and left one saying, "Back soon." This way, if Mr. Ugg came to visit while she was out, he'd know to stay around for a while until she got back. The prospect of finally meeting him made Wind feel nervous and self-conscious about how boring her messages always were compared to his, so she decided to get artistic and illustrate it by drawing a foot with wings on the heel, though it seemed he had taken up a new project, as there was a sign up for a buck zoo, complete with a picture of a fully antlered buck. But maybe, just maybe, he had gone to visit her and saw her sign and decided to wait until she got back. So she dashed out a quick hello, leaving, and then rushed back to her house with all the swiftness of Mercury, but found only a message that said, "Revalue hello." It was an interesting message and gave her something to ponder. Maybe she was spending too much time trying to greet and talk to Mr. Ugg and not enough time on her own projects. She'd thought about building a fence along the edge, but it had always seemed like too big a project. Now that she knew that her world was a loop, she realized she could actually finish this project and build a fence around the entire world. She started with the side below her house and started around toward Mr. Ugg's. But she saw to her surprise that Mr. Ugg was building a fence of his own on the other edge of the world. Maybe he had gone to visit her and saw the beginnings of her fence and decided to help out. And when she got back to her home, she was pleased to see that her entire world was safe and she'd only had to build a fence along one edge of it. Secure in the knowledge that Mr. Ugg wasn't going anywhere, Wind started pursuing other projects in the following days. For example, she got a pet dog, which helped her feel a bit less lonely, and built a doghouse. She still wandered over to Mr. Ugg's place on occasion, just to see how he was doing. It seemed that recently he'd gotten religious because he'd built what appeared to be a small church. Suddenly, the ground began to split. It was an earthquake so powerful that it was ripping her world apart. Wind quickly got away from the dangerous new edge that was being torn through her world, but her dog was still on the other side. She ran, trying to get past the crack, but the world was splitting right down the center all the way around. She could still hear her dog barking, but the sound faded as the two sides of her world separated and drifted apart. Would she ever see her dog again? And what about Mr. Ugg?